Greetings and welcome to another edition of Planet Wave TV. I'm Eric Francis Coppolino, host of Planet Waves FM and author of the Planet Waves horoscope. Welcome. So, last week I put out a video about the family Hunger Games, which included discussion of the Centaur planet Pholus. And someone commented and said, "Oh boy, thank you for finally providing a succinct definition of a Centaur planet." And I thought, well, that's an interesting point. And furthermore, the videos had close to 500 views. By YouTube scale, not a lot. For me, that's pretty good. And the subject matter was, I think, not your average astrology. So before we get into the gas giants and the ice giants next week, sign changes of Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, I wanted to do a short video, we'll see how short it actually comes out, about the Centaur planets, pulling focus a little bit on what these things are and how they came into being and why we need them in astrology, why we use them in astrology. So I'm going to cover in this video Chiron, discovered in 1977, Pholus, discovered in 1992, and Nessus, discovered in 1993. So there was the first discovery in in 77, and then there was a gap, and then the pace picked up very quickly because I think more astronomers were looking out at deep space. In 1992, overall, a very important year in the history of astronomy, and in particular minor planet astrology. And so when I say minor planet, I mean anything that is not one of the 8 official planets. And to say that there are 8 planets is like telling kids that Columbus discovered America. It's completely ridiculous for reasons that you're about to see. And so to do this kind of astrology, you need to think in terms of a solar system model that is very different than what we were brought up with, and potentially you can get a look behind controversies like, is Pluto a planet? Again, completely ridiculous concept, because the word planet doesn't really have a definition, except in Greek it means something that is moving, something that's orbiting the sun. So it's a wanderer, basically. That's actually what the word means. And so one thing to be aware of when you are getting involved in astrology is false controversies. And pretty much you can safely count any controversy as a false controversy because they're generally entirely bullshit. And any alleged controversy in astrology that you run past me, I will dismantle it in 30 seconds or less. So that's a standing challenge. Okay, so let's consider what our solar system is really made of. Okay, so we have this notion of like 8 planets. You can go there, you can send a spaceman, you can walk around on them, and all of this stuff. But actually, what the solar system looks like is, it doesn't look like it. This is a diagram basically of the solar system. And this is not planets orbiting any other sun but our own. This is about planets in our solar system. Currently, there are 750,000 with catalog numbers. Catalog number means like 2060 Chiron. It's officially in the catalog. Many of them don't have names. There's a lot of name depletion going on. There's definitely not enough names from mythology worldwide to name all the planets after things like myths, and this is why we end up with planets like asteroids like Jerry Garcia or various different things like that. But let me give you a brief tour of what this is. So the sun is in the middle, and remember, this is not drawn to scale. It is not drawn to scale. If it was drawn to scale, Pluto, which shows up right about here, it doesn't really matter. I don't know what day this was cast for. But if this were actually drawn in proportion, Pluto would be like 50 feet away. So the distances are much greater. They're much greater in proportion, but this gives you an idea of the different populations of planets. What kind of planets there are that exist. So here's the sun. Let me see. Here's the Earth. And so again, remember that the distances are all wrong, but the concentricity and the proportions of populations are correct. So here's the sun. That's at the middle. That's holding the whole thing together. Here's the Earth. And here's Venus. And you can see that around the Earth there are a bunch of, can't really see it so good, but I'll include a JPEG of this so it's easier to see. And I guess you can buy the poster somewhere. But near the Earth, there's a bunch of asteroids that kind of follow the Earth around. They're called near-Earth asteroids. There's not very much in the inner solar system where Mercury is and where Venus is. There's some speculation that there's a thing called Vulcan, but nobody's ever seen it. And so it's hypothetical, right? But it's not like a thing that you could walk around on. Okay, so now when we get out past Mars, this is the orbit of Mars. You can see Mars has a 2-year orbit. Earth has a 1-year orbit. Mars 2-year orbit. Just past Mars, there is this massive asteroid belt. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of asteroids orbiting just beyond the orbit of Mars. And most of them have an orbit of 4 years. And they have all different interesting topics, and I know how to use a lot of them, but they're not, I don't think they're the most important thing. Now, some of them really stand out, but I use them judiciously and as needed. Pretty much I use all planets on an as needed basis, but when we get into Chiron, Nessus, and Pholus, I think they're pretty much basic. Okay, so this is the inner asteroid belt. That's what it's called, the inner asteroid belt, or the Mars, beyond Mars, 4-year orbit. Mars 2-year orbit. Planets in this blue area have approximately 4-year orbit. It includes Ceres. It includes Pallas Athene. Ceres is 1/3 of the mass. One asteroid comprises 1/3 of the mass of this entire inner asteroid belt. And then we're familiar with Vesta, the brightest asteroid. We're familiar with Juno. Those are the first 4 discovered between 1801 and approximately there were 5 by 1845. Astrea became the 5th one. Okay, so now these asteroids have a 4-year orbit, and there's lots of them. Then we go out to the orbit of Jupiter, and we see that asteroids gather around Jupiter at 60 degrees. Imagine Jupiter's there. And so following Jupiter are a whole bunch of asteroids on either side, the Greeks and the Trojans. Generally, they're referred to as Trojan asteroids. Trojan asteroids are in Jupiter's orbit. Jupiter has a 12-year orbit, and there's a whole bunch of asteroids out there with a 12-year orbit, and frankly, they're hardly ever used by astrologers. But at Serenu.com, a good number of them are listed. So they're gonna basically more or less move through the solar system at about the same rate as Jupiter. All right, so then we get into the orbit of let's see where Saturn is here. Okay. So this is Saturn, and it has a 29-year orbit. So we go from 12-year orbit to a 29-year orbit in one jump. And then we go from Saturn's 29-year orbit out to Uranus. That has an 84-year orbit. And then we go out to Neptune with approximately 145-year orbit. Okay, so let's just get, as with many things Neptune, it evades memory. 164. Glad I checked. 164 Earth years it takes Neptune to go around. So you can see that as these points go out further and further, the time that it takes to orbit the sun gets considerably longer real fast. We go from 4-year here to 12-year here to 29-year here, out to 84-year here, out to 164-ish years here, 164.8, 165. And then out beyond that, there is this population of other small objects. This is called the Kuiper Belt. Pluto was the first object discovered in the Kuiper Belt in 1930. And for a long time, this astronomer Kuiper first predicts that the Kuiper Belt is going to exist, then he unpredicts the Kuiper Belt is going to exist. And just because you find Pluto out there doesn't mean that you're going to find other things. You don't know what you're going to find till you find it, though there are methods of kind of being mathematically predictive, and that's how Neptune was discovered, for example, because they have ways to track the anomalies in the orbits of other planets, and they can say, well, we've measured these, and it looks like there's going to be something out there, and then they look around hard enough, and then sure enough, they find it. Now, one interesting thing is that before any of these things were discovered, anything besides the visible 7 lights in the sky, Galileo, I believe this was in the winter of, I want to just get this one right, Galileo, I've even got this chart somewhere, but again, I've moved my charts across the room. Galileo spots Neptune. That would have been in the winter of 1612 and 1613. 1612 and 1613. He sees Neptune, but he doesn't realize it's a planet. And so Neptune, if you read the Wikipedia page for Neptune, it's accurate and it's hilarious. Neptune keeps appearing and disappearing and appearing and disappearing, just like it does in astrology. It's got this weird morphy thing where you really can't pin it down. And so the great Galileo Galilei actually saw this, recorded its movement of a quarter of a degree, 15 arc minutes in his notebook, but it didn't occur to him that it was a planet. Now, fixed stars don't orbit, but fixed stars move because the Earth is wobbling slightly on its axis. It makes one full wobble every approximately 26,000 years. What that results in is fixed stars seeming to move 1 degree every 70 years, but Neptune retrograde moved much quicker. So I don't know what he was thinking when he didn't put together that it was actually a planet orbiting our sun. Leftover tea from Planet Waves FM Friday morning actually. Okay, so we're out to Pluto, right? And Pluto is out here in the Kuiper Belt. It's a 6-body system. Pluto, Chiron, Nix, Hydra. There's several of them, and there was nothing discovered out in the Kuiper Belt besides Pluto until 1992. So 1992 is a watershed year in planetary astronomy. Okay, so all the planets shown, you can see here, have very consistent but slightly elliptical orbits, with the exception of Pluto, which can come in, when it comes in close to the sun, it goes through a sign in about 15, 16 years, and when it goes further out, which it's on the way to doing, it goes through one sign in about 30 years. So Pluto is not only a very elliptical orbit, but it's also inclined to the plane of the solar system, so it will kind of float off the page. And mostly the solar system exists on a plane like Saturn's rings. There are some things that go higher and lower, and everything changes in declination. But there's a kind of a bandwidth where most of the planets are, and in terms of their three-dimensional height off of this flat plane. But with Pluto, it's coming in on like this wild angle. It comes in off this very steep angle, which is part of what makes Pluto so strange. And so it's the way that the orbit is very egg-shaped, and the way that it's on this very steeply inclined plane, aspecting the rest of the solar system. Okay, so this first of all should disabuse you of any notion that there are 8 planets. Again, 750,000 have catalog numbers, and approximately 1.4 million are waiting for catalog numbers. So that the out to 1.4 million. So it's approximately 750,000 with and 700,000 without, and these astronomers are very busy. They're always looking for things. And now they have digital assistants and various different sky surveys. But I'm kind of sitting here thinking, wow, what must somebody be thinking who thought there was only 8 planets? All right, now let's get into the concept of a centaur. Now, the first one of these, we thought the first one was Chiron. And but I'm going to challenge that notion in a second. So what we have with Chiron is the first thing that is identified in an orbit anything like this. And the interesting thing about Chiron, and the thing that makes it distinctive, is that its egg-shaped orbit brings it in closer to the Sun than Saturn's orbit. And then it goes almost all the way out to Uranus's orbit. Now, I keep looking this up over and over again. Chiron is not officially a Uranus crosser, but it goes through Aries in 9 years, whereas Uranus goes through every sign in about 7 years. So I haven't reconciled that, and you have to live with these kind of mysteries. And then, then sooner or later I'll have a planetary astronomer on the phone, on an interview, and I'll ask the question. So it's good to leave your questions standing. And when they become more important, when you have to answer the question, you answer the question. When you want to answer the question, you answer the question. And it takes a lot of patience to do this. It's a good thing that I was a kind of a journalist who was accustomed to taking years to work on a single story, as opposed to, the kind who just get it done. You start at 10 in the morning and you're done at 5 o'clock, and then you're on to something else the next day. So these are the other kind of story, the kind that can take a long time. So let's keep talking about Chiron. So you can see that Chiron is a Saturn crosser, and that's what makes it a centaur. Now, Pluto crosses the orbit of Neptune, but it's considered a Kuiper object because it's out in the Kuiper belt. And though I don't have an orbital diagram here, which I could have done, I guess I could pause, but there was a planet discovered in 1920 called Hidalgo, orbit of Hidalgo. So Hidalgo, named for the priest who supposedly led the Mexican Revolution, is a Jupiter crosser. 9. Let's see. Hold on. Pardon me. Yep. It's definitely 5.7, just barely a Jupiter crosser. So Hidalgo was considered an asteroid, but sometime fairly recently, Hidalgo was recategorized as a centaur. And so for those of you who are Chiron fans, who think that Chiron was the first centaur, well, it was the first thing ever designated a centaur. And was named for a centaur. It was named for, I don't have one of my Chiron coins laying around. I never know what I'm going to do for these things, but I did spend the part of the evening making up these finding these diagrams and printing them out. So what makes Chiron so interesting is that when it comes in close to Saturn, it can move through a sign in 18 months. And when it's out by Uranus, it can move through a sign in 9 years. And this creates very interesting patterns. Now, Charles Kowal, the discoverer of Chiron, named it for Chiron because he said that it was a maverick. So the first keyword for Chiron comes from its planetary discoverer, Charles Kowal, and also it had properties of a comet, an asteroid, and a planet. So it was kind of a fusion of different things. Miraculously, nothing had been named Chiron, and so Kowal names it Chiron. Chiron is a centaur, and then astronomers are kind of waiting for when the next time they're going to look for when they're going to find a centaur to match it. And it's only theoretical to that point. You only assume that they're there, right? And how do you know? I mean, you're not going to see gravitational anomalies with something like Pholus, which is like half the size of Chiron. Chiron's like 160 kilometers, a giant comet nucleus. So thematically, Chiron addresses matters of healing. I did a whole video with Zane Stein, the author of the first book about Chiron called Essence and Application. And the early astrologers who were working on Chiron all started to see this. And a body of delineation starts to emerge around Chiron fairly early on in its process. In the early 1980s, Chiron discovered in 77. The astronomers aren't really getting down to the nitty-gritty till 81, 82 or so. Again, this is the video. You look up a video with me with Zane Stein, and you'll see this whole history told. But we get these themes, and the themes emerge primarily at the time that Chiron is making aspects to its own natal position, like when it moves 90 degrees to its own natal position or 180 degrees, and when it's making aspects to other planets. And so for those of you who are wondering what Chiron is about in your chart, you just need to look at your Chiron transits. To do that, you have to know what a transit is and how to look at transits and look them up. But that's not that complicated, but it requires a step of mastering a basic skill. And so astrology is learned through a series of steps of mastering basic skills, then applying those skills and integrating them. And usually you master them in the process of basic application. Skills like the rulerships. For example, Venus rules Taurus, and Saturn rules Capricorn and Aquarius, and Neptune, well, let's skip Neptune for a second. Jupiter rules Pisces and Sagittarius. And so you memorize and learn and master the basic planetary rulerships of the planets that existed, that were known to Ptolemy and the early Greeks, because they could see them. They didn't have telescopes until Galileo came along made a telescope up and started looking for planets. So the main thing that we need to know about Chiron and Hidalgo, and what makes them centaurs, and what makes them more relevant, what makes them stand out above most of the things in this swarm, is that they cross the orbits of other planets. Most of these things do no such thing. I mean, the asteroids are all kind of dancing around, but that's like way too complicated to get any relevant meaning out of. But with Chiron, we have this very basic thing. It crosses Saturn, and it goes out to Uranus, and really, spiritually, I consider it a Uranus crosser, because it goes through a sign in more years than Uranus goes through a sign. And if you happen to know about this branch of planetary science, write me an email, efc@planetwaves.net, and give me your point of view. Now, one other thing, most astrologers do not pay any attention to astronomy. They might know an eclipse is coming. Yeah, of course they'll know an eclipse. They know about the phases of Venus, and then they go straight to Inanna and all this stuff. They go right into the myth. To do minor planet astrology, as you're seeing, you have to know some astronomy. You just have to know it. And astronomy is not about looking through telescopes necessarily, though that is fun. Astronomy is largely about the categorization and nomenclature of things, which matters when you're doing minor planet astrology, because to understand what these planets are about, we have to base it on something, and one of the things it's based on is the myth, the name of the planet, but you can delineate the planet long before the planet is named, and there's a diversity of ways to do that, and mostly they are involving what are called the orbital elements. And so the orbital elements of Chiron It has a 50.7-year orbit, so approximately 51 years. It was discovered on 11/1/77. It's about 180 kilometers. And back to the orbit, its aphelion, the far point from the sun, is about 19 times the Earth-Sun distance. Chiron is close to its aphelion right now. It was some years ago, I think in the early 2020s, and it was out to approximately 19 times the distance from the Earth to the sun. Those are called astronomical units, so 18 AUs, 18.87. The perihelion is 8.5 AUs, so it comes in to 8.5 Earth-Sun distances, and Saturn's distance is 9.5 AUs. So Chiron comes in almost one whole Earth-Sun distance closer to the sun than Saturn. Okay, confused yet? So you study these things when you need to. You study them to have background. You study them to be erudite. You want to know things. Part of being an astrologer is you're going to know a lot of things you're not necessarily going to have very much use for, but it makes very good fodder for learning later on. And astrology and ignorance do not go together. Prejudice and astrology do not go together. To do this work, you must have an open mind and not be jamming things into the corner of what you think they mean. Part of having an open mind means being open to the possibilities, and then gradually the meaning of things starts to make itself known in context. Meaning is context. All right, so enough philosophy. Here is Chiron, and now let's look at some other centaurs. So for this one, we're going to kind of skip the individual diagrams, but let's, for example, look at Chiron's orbit is this right here, and you can see it goes almost out to Uranus. Okay, now in 1992, another object was spotted, a very red object spotted on, let's see, that would be January 9th, 1992. And it was found through repeated observation to have an orbit of 92 years. Now you might be saying, how do they discover the thing and know that it has an orbit of 92 years? Right? Wouldn't that take 92 years? Well, no, actually it doesn't. You can figure out the length and shape of the orbit from a very small sample. You can interpolate or extrapolate. Actually, you can have this much of the orbit. You can have this little bit much here, and then they can tell you how long it's going to take to go around the sun, and they know how far it is, and there's a lot of this is based in mathematics. I mean, this is mathematics and astronomy are very closely related, but you don't have to do the math most of the time. You just have to know that the math is there most of the time. That's the important part of this. So please don't be put off by the math part. Anyway, 1992, this very red rocky object is spotted, and that was initially, I forget the provisional designation. It got the MPC, Minor Planet Catalog number 5145. And note that, Chiron, discovered in 1977, has Minor Planet Catalog number 2060, and then 12 years later, they're up to 5145. And then they start going real fast because now they're up to, 1.4 million. Okay, so Pholus has a 92-year orbit, and let's find that orbit in this diagram. So here's the orbit of Pholus. This looks like it's here. And it goes out past the orbit of Neptune. See that? It goes out past the orbit of Neptune, and it comes in to the orbit of Saturn. So it's hard to say which planet's gravity controls it. It's probably a combination of Uranus and Uranus, Saturn, and Neptune that control it. And there are people who could tell you what the latest theory is on which large planet has the most gravitational influence. All right. So, but what we know is that Saturn is a Neptune crosser. It's a Saturn crosser, it's a Uranus crosser, and it's a Neptune crosser. Pholus is a very, very powerful planet. And though it somewhat follows in the footsteps of Chiron, it has a whole different mode of action. Chiron has a very slow mode of action that then is activated at various key points. Pholus is in itself represents a kind of a release point. The central metaphor in the myth of Pholus is a cask of wine that's opened and can't be closed, and so things get out, and the scent of the wine, which was the collective property of the centaurs, gets out, and then, like a lot of centaurs, they start to show up wanting to get drunk, and then also Heracles is roasting meat. I can't get into the myth too much in this because that's a whole other talk, and it's going to get in the way of the studying the orbits of these things. So Pholus discovered in January of 1992. So now there's two things that have these orbit crossing orbits. Nobody's thinking of Hidalgo at this point yet. That eventually gets added in. But now there's two, and then there's officially the Centaur class of planets defined because they found a second one out in this vicinity crossing the orbits of, for example, of the gas giants and the ice giants. And so this thing of crossing the orbits of other planets makes them influential in this kind of weird Morphe dream of astrology, but you can test it because you can test it. So you test it reading your chart, you test it reading other people's charts, and you work your ass off not to bring bias into the conversation. You don't want to have a prejudice and then prove your own point by refusing to accept any other sources of information. This happens quite a bit, and you need to be able to spot the astrologers who are not capable of disproving their own theory or arguing both sides of the equation. This is not a good intellectual art form to be too cocksure within. And so you take your time in delineating these things. I was made aware of Pholus in 1998, so that's like 27 years ago, and I pretty much cast it into every chart since that time. And so that's the kind of thing that gives you experience, and then you just listen to people's stories. So with Pholus, suddenly there's a Centaur class of planets. Okay, that's very interesting. Now there's probably about 75 planets in that class. And I say planet, I'm not going to say word minor planet, dwarf planet, and all this. I just say planet. It orbits the sun. It's a frickin' planet. And these categories are, we can do a class on the categories, but it just starts to get real stupid. But centaurs have this special property. And the special property is that they cross the orbits of other planets, which gives the centaur some of that mojo. So Nessus has got quite a bit of Pholus has got quite a bit of mojo because it's linking together Saturn through Uranus out to Neptune. There you go. All right. So just as a side note, while we're rambling on here, in 1992, in August of 1992, two astronomers, Jane Liu and Dave Jewett, were working at the University of Hawaii's telescope. They had a grant for another research project. They would complete their work on that research project, and then they set out to do a scan of the outer solar system out by Pluto, looking for something that was out there. And they found 1992 QB1, which became Albion, which was the first planet discovered beyond the orbit of Pluto. That, too, was in 1992. And so what's interesting, the Pholus connection, the Pholus connection to that is that Pholus describes an uncontainable release, right? And so it happened that after Pholus was discovered, then QB1 is discovered, and then suddenly there was an uncontrollable release of discoveries in the Centaur class and in the Kuiper belt, such that Pluto used to be the only lonely member of the Kuiper belt, And now in this diagram, it's accurately drawn in as there's a kind of a swarm out in the Kuiper belt. And that swarm first starts to show up in 1992. Dave Jewett and Jane Liu, two of my favorite figures in the history of modern science. All right, now let's look at Nessus. So what does Nessus do? Nessus crosses the orbit of Neptune. It does not cross, none of these cross the orbit of Pluto, but Eris does not cross the orbit of Pluto. And then Nessus comes in, it crosses the orbit of Uranus, but it does not cross the orbit of Saturn. So the original three centaurs, which are the three that I put in every chart, Chiron, Pholus, Nessus. Nessus is the only one that does not have any Saturn to it. There's no, it lacks all of the containment and the discipline that the others have. Now, in the case of Pholus, the containment starts as a cask of wine, and the containment is breached, and so there's always some story of containment being breached when we're in Pholus territory. Now, with Nessus, there's a whole other type of structure to the story, and so Nessus is first of all the consummate bad boy. Like it's like bad man, right? So the theme of Nessus has all kinds of elements of betrayal and of the violation of trust, which is what betrayal is. And there's a sex scene in the myth of Nessus where it's not clear whether it's consensual sex paid as a toll to cross a river because Nessus guarded the river, or just sex for fun. So that's left ambiguous in the Greek myth. So there's this theme of like kind of gray area sexual transgression associated with Nessus, and then there is this theme of the return of karma. So the whole structure of the myth of Nessus is that it represents the cycles of karma. So it's like one thing leads to another, leads to another, and then eventually things come back. And kind of Nessus invokes kind of the law of unintended consequences. So where you see Nessus active, you're having a big Nessus transit, or you see Nessus doing something in a mutual aspect with other planets, that don't directly involve your chart so much. Still, you want to be paying attention to the law of unintended consequences, and that's a big part of the Nessus story. Nessus, by the way, discovered in 1973, just 1 year after Pholus. And with astronomers, it's almost like they don't find anything, they usually don't find anything that they're not already convinced exists in the first place. So the people that find things, the astronomers that make discoveries, are the ones who are, for whatever reason, pretty sure that the thing is going to be there, and then they go looking for it, and they find it. So the basic summation of what a Centaur planet is, and let's go back to the Chiron one, because it's just a little less of a headache. As long as we remember that in the midst of this, there's a whole bunch of other planets whose orbits are not really shown, which make this kind of weird irregular spirograph type of shape. Okay. In 1994 TA, I'm not sure if that was named, it was found, it was lost, I don't know, I'm not sure what happened to 1994 TA, but that was discovered among the first centaurs, and as was Chariklo, as was Asbolus, which are the ones that really are my go-tos. All right, but let's go back to this fairly simple diagram that tells us what Chiron does. And remember, Chiron's orbit is not circular. Chiron's orbit is elliptical. These are just schematic diagrams. So it's by elliptical, it's going to have a much more stretchy orbit, but it's not really convenient to do that on like a teaching diagram like this. So centaurs cross planets, therefore they join the themes of the planets that they cross. And it's kind of that simple, but their action is not simple. They're all very intense. They are precipitous. They precipitate events when they make transits. And so this is one of the reasons why I don't really do I do one kind of a reading called a Chiron Keys reading, where I give an interpretation of Chiron, but I also give the transit dates of Chiron so that those dates can be studied, and then the meaning can come from the context of the transits. Okay? So you work with both. And the way that I learned Chiron was, yes, partly from reading books, but then I learned Chiron from doing hundreds upon hundreds of readings where I went through the transits, I looked them up, and I heard the story of what happened during those transits. So when we're getting into this minor planet astrology, it's not like the books on my shelf over there, which tell you what Saturn means. Well, now we're going to tell you what Mars means. Now we're going to tell you what Venus square Mars means, and it's I got a mountain of these books, and they're like, that's what that means. That's what that means. That you can't do that with these planets. You might start to get some sense of a delineation from good books like Barbara Hand Clow, Chiron Rainbow Bridge, or Melanie Reinhardt, Chiron and the Healing Journey, and others. But even those interpretations are just starting points. So you learn that they should be counted as story leads, and not the conclusive, definitive, defined meaning. Because once you start getting into some concept of definitive, defined meaning, the entire investigative process is over. And so it's very good to keep things in the column of the unknown. And with astrology, you're in the human realm. Like, this is just it's basically a diagram. There's orbital cycles and all of that stuff. I don't think any of these things are actually affecting us, quote unquote, affecting us. I think it's all symbolic representation, and it's also, the cycles are definitely meaningful. I mean, for example, when Chiron was discovered, there was the planet with a 29-ish year orbit and another one with a 84-year orbit. There was nothing with an orbit anywhere between that. And so for a lot of reasons, Chiron was very interesting, because Chiron has a 50.7-year orbit. And so it really is in between Saturn and Uranus. And to close up with one last example, with how these things blend the energy of the planets, once you start using Chiron, you find that it has a very Saturnian side and a very Uranian side. It has an element of it that can really take a long time and require much thought and much planning. And then you have another version, another expression of Chiron, where it can act in this very powerful and precipitous manner. But I don't think it makes very much sense to attempt to predict what it's going to do, but rather find out from asking your client about their personal history, remembering that when you do so, you're going to hear things that are likely to be very difficult, and that you may not know what to do with if the client goes out into some very deep and fraught emotional water. So, you have to be mindful when you're using these things, and work with, if you're doing this thing I suggest, which is to take the transits of 10 people, start with people you know pretty well and who you have a basis of trust and understanding with, and then slowly work your way out, see what happens with them, and then slowly work your way through the people in your life, and start asking people you don't know so well about the events at the time of their, let's just start with Chiron transits. Once you learn Chiron, then you've mastered or you've kind of acquired a partial skill. Chiron, I don't think Chiron is ever really mastered. There are things that they're not cut and dried ever. And because people's experience of Chiron is so divergent, it's so distinct, that you just don't know what you don't know what you're going to get, and you have to be very gentle, because you don't know what you're going to get. Okay, so that in 44 minutes is my introduction to the Centaurs. Please like the channel. Please subscribe to the channel. We're inching our way toward 5,000. We're trying to get some of these things to get like a larger audience than 500 or 1,000 people. And I have been basically, practicing this branch of astrology since 1994. I started on Chiron very early, and I'm eager to share what I have learned. I think that I have a, let's say, therapeutically sound and humane approach to working with these very sensitive, often difficult points, but also with my astrology generally. So later in the week, I'm going to do something that I'm recording now on Sunday, May 18. I don't know when you're seeing this, but a little bit later in the week, I'm going to do something that sums up this really exciting thing we've got going on with the great big planets. So I thought I would pay homage one last time, get the microscope out, and then with when we get into Saturn, Jupiter, Uranus, and Neptune, we're really talking about macro, transpersonal, major main streets of the psyche. Here, we're kind of on the back streets of the psyche. And to end with one last metaphor, if you ever go to Paris or really any other really, really old city, except New York City kind of completely sucks right now, but any old European city, what you'll find is that there are the grand boulevards. There's just the grand boulevards, right? And that's where 90% of the tourists are going to be. But if you really want to find something interesting in Paris, duck down an alley, go into the back of a neighborhood, explore the 7th arrondissement. That's my favorite of the arrondissements, and it's full of all these alleyways and passageways and things with like bookstores that have been there for 50 or 100 years and violin shops that have been there for 150 years, but they're not on the Champs-Élysées. They're not on the big main streets where everyone's taking selfies of themselves with whatever, the Arc de Triomphe or the Eiffel Tower. Who fucking cares? What makes a place interesting is what's going on the back streets. That's where you find stuff that kind of changes you. And the same is true with these planets. That said, we will be venturing out onto the main streets in the next video. I'm Eric Francis, professor of astronomy at the University of Colorado at South Park. That's Ike. I've even got my diploma. I sent away for it from bubblegum wrappers. All right. Lots of love. See you over at Planet Waves, and bye for now.